Good evening, and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. My name is Rosa Vasquez, and I'm a sophomore at the college studying government. I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors that are located both on the park side and the JFK side of the forum. In an event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate at JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Halpernm, which is also listed in your programs. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, David Halpern and our moderator, Todd Rogers.
Hi. Good evening. It is a privilege to introduce David Halpern. He's from a small island off the coast of Europe.
At the moment.
What's that?
At the moment. It's a terrific thing.
He received his PhD in social and political sciences at St. John's College, was a lecturer at the University of Cambridge, worked with as a chief analyst at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Prime Minister Tony Blair, and was a founding director of the Institute for Government, which I think we might hear more about. And since 2010, has been the chief executive of the Behavioural Insights team, which we will hear a bunch about over the next hour in Prime Minister David Cameron's administration. It's now a social purpose company that is jointly owned by the UK government, Nesta, and its employees. BIT now works in over 26 countries and has offices in London, Manchester, New York, and Singapore. He's written several books on areas relating to behavioral insights and well-being, including Social Capital, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, and Inside the Nudge Unit, which is this right here. You guys, it's his most recent book. You might want to buy it. It's great. And personally, this is a great honor for me. David's rigor in research as a scientist and his social impact as a public servant is inspiration to me and to an entire generation of behavioral scientists. And I think we will learn a bunch about, hopefully you will share that feeling of inspiredness. David, let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about just the story to orient everyone on the origin of the Behavioral Insights team and how it came to be and where it is now?
Very happy to do that. Nice to be here. I mean, we did look at using behavioral science when I worked for Tony Blair. I worked with him for 6 years. We used it at the margin, but any kind of more public outings was a complete disaster. So that's interesting background. But in the run-up to 2010, the situation was changing. I was still then at the Institute for Government, but we did a piece of work called the Mindspace Report, which was tried to rehearse, well, imagine you tried to have a more realistic model of human behavior and you put it into policy. What would that look and feel like? How would it take you to different places? Of course, we were also greatly aided by some guys had written a book called Nudge over here, and Cass had gone into the White House in, 2009. But in particular, you had then turned out to be incoming government, which was centre-right, and it sort of set the stage in a helpful way because those around Cameron were looking for alternative narratives, particularly alternative to regulations, as it was often presented. And it turned out the British government was kind of broke. So that meant that you, as it were, for Whitehall and the government at that time, you'd taken away the two primary tools, regulation, spend more money to fix things. And it then fitted with this notion of, well, could you use nudge-style approaches? So the team was then set up. Initially, it was very small inside Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. We split between. This kind of relatively skunk work team was the idea. It would kind of disrupt policy and it would introduce these new ways of thinking. And so that's kind of how it all started. And we had both basically political and administrative support, and we had some good stuff going on in America which we could shamelessly steal.
Okay, so you formed the Behavioral Insights team, and people have heard various stories about some of its greatest successes. I think just to get us oriented, what are some of the highest impact projects that the Behavioral Insights team has done in the UK or abroad or around the world?
Yeah, well, as you'll know, the kind of the poster kid still, which precedes BIT, but we did kind of help marshal through, was changing defaults on pensions to drive up savings rates. In the UK now we're heading towards 8-9 million extra savers. As a result, it's thought of defaults, and And indeed now we see the step up as well, so that's a pretty big deal for many people, given its extraordinary effectiveness. Other ones I think maybe less well known, but we were certainly very proud of early wins were, of course, getting people back to work faster was, I think, a body of work which I thought was really, really neat. Could we change the script, as it were, for the unemployed? In Britain we have job centres, as in many countries that the unemployed go to, and for literally decades, built on active welfare policy, so-called, people would be asked to show they were looking for work. You have to come in and show 3 jobs you looked for last week, and we turned that around to say, we made a number of changes, but a key one was forget asking people what they did last week, which is basically because we don't trust you, and instead, why don't we ask you what you're going to do next week? And it's built around implementation intentions, prompting people to think about what they'll do and when, etc. Anyhow, hey presto, it gets people back to work faster, and it particularly helps those who are most disorganized in their job search. So it's a beautiful example because it's, it looks like it's a sort of small change, but it's going to help someone back into the labour market faster, which reduces scarring, and it reduced costs to the state. It's like, why wouldn't you do it? And it also had this wonderful impact, as it happens, on the job centre staff who felt more energised about their work. Other big ones often quoted are, and continues to be used often in many parts of the world as a starting point, getting people to pay their taxes on time, which turns out sort of important if you want to have public services. So again, even relatively small changes, and a famous early example was tell people something which is true, which is most people pay their taxes on time. And it boosts payment rates for late payers. So there's of course, and as you know, there are. So
that's a famous one. Can you describe that just so people see how the
tax?
The tax one is sort of surprising.
Yeah, of course we went on to do many more in other countries too. So, but it was important. It also helped to. I mean, one of the questions people ask is how did it become acceptable? Was the result also very clear and you could monetize it? So yeah, we tested basically built on Cialdini's work in many ways, social proof. Just telling people this very simple act for a block of people who are late paying their tax, adding in one line, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, which is true in Britain. And then we tested further variations. So most people in your area pay their tax on time, have already paid, etc. More tuned to who you are. You're one of the few people yet to pay your tax on time. That's bringing you up to several percentage point. And if we say most people in your area pay their tax on time, you are one of the few yet to do so. It was a 5 percentage point increase in payment, or a 15% uplift in the payment rate without further prompt. So if you can get that from one line on a letter, right, and you start to turn the numbers when you're in business of collecting, well, literally billions, because it's enormous value, and it helped to persuade many skeptical internal audiences about the efficacy. And because interestingly, we now know that also very similar techniques seem to operate across the world. We did work in Guatemala, for example, which has very low tax morale, as it's euphemistically called. And you definitely can't say that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. But even there, when you say, 62% of people pay this tax at some point, you wouldn't be very impressed, even in America, about that. But nonetheless, that was boost the payment rates quite dramatically. It's because we overestimate the prevalence of bad behaviour in other people, and it seems to be true across countries. Interestingly, we don't overestimate the prevalence of good behaviour in other people, but that is quite consequential. So yeah, the tax results very powerful, and that led to a whole series of further work.
Yeah, I ask about the tax one because the question that people often ask me, and that I always wonder, is how you facilitate buy-in at the levels that you've had it with, like at the federal government levels. And it seems like that's a critical part of the story. Some version of it's the first project, some version the outcome is revenue.
Well, if it's any comfort, it wasn't straightforward. And even if you come from Downing Street, it doesn't mean everybody will cooperate. Other departments have lots of ways of saying, thanks but no thanks. As indeed I know other colleagues have found in other parts of the world, that it's not necessarily straightforward to get buy-in. With tax, it was also, again, one of those things in Retroflex just seems obvious. Why wouldn't you experiment with letters in which, why did you think that letter you wrote was so brilliant it could never be improved on? But it was still extremely controversial to do it, and it was by no means straightforward we get buy-in. So it took quite a while to get the agreement of the department, the tax department, and in the end we had to do it by essentially identifying someone. I did a deal with the head of the department saying, look, I tell you what, we will find someone who we think is really good, but you will employ them directly, you will then keep them in the department, no data will leave, etc., etc. And we also said, which I forgot about this now, if it's a disaster, you can blame us, and if it's good, you can take credit for it, which also helped. But still, then you've got the manual aspects, because you haven't got a system built to do even randomization. It seems simple. Let's take 1,000 letters, 5,000 letters, and substitute them at random. We literally, I mean, someone has to go pull letters out at random, whatever, replace the alternative. And it's literal physical massive machines that are printing and doing this stuff. And of course, you've got to build all the tracking and all the rest of it. So it's easy when you see the graph, but as you know, behind it is like a huge amount of work to make that possible. But fortunately, it worked. And rest is history, as they say.
But it started in a couple of areas in the UK, and as I've come to understand, you're expanding into like massively broad range of both government functions and kinds of interventions. Yeah. I'm particularly interested in, as you describe this, like how you get buy-in, how you foster continued support, but also like I'm interested in the scope of the kinds of projects you're interested in and you guys are working on now. Yeah,
well, look, so early on it was really important, I think, for us to get some early wins and results. As I'm kind of hinting, and you'll know in a school of government, there are pretty big limits to how much you can instruct departments and places to do things. Ultimately, you have to persuade, and we always took the view it was better to achieve conversion than compliance, if you see what I mean. So rather than just getting someone because we're forcing you to do it, that we really wanted departments and others to sort of think, actually, this is effective. Because otherwise, the question you always want to ask yourself is, will they carry on doing this when you're not watching, when you're not on their case, when you're not hassling them, or, you know, the politics have waxed and waned. So that's one of the reasons why, and as you also will know, when we set up the Behavioural Insight team originally, it was with a 2-year sunset clause. So the presumption was we would shut it unless the Prime Minister specifically signed off an extension. So we were under real pressure to get results. That's why we went early on for ones, and it's true when we work in other countries too. Go to areas where they're already data rich, they're well suited, you can do rapid trials. As you know, often people think of, you can do a randomized controlled trial. Great, that means it's going to cost us millions and we'll have to wait 10 years and you'll tell us it didn't work, which is not a very appealing sell. As opposed to, no, we could do this really rapidly and you get these results in real time. So the first batch of results coming in, if I remember well, I talk about it in the book, I think, when we first presented them to our heads of departments was a key moment where you could just almost feel the sort of skepticism like dropping away and, oh, this stuff actually is useful to us. And that then opened the door to apply it in many more areas, which are more complicated, like in education, right, or in relation to the environment, or many other areas. So, yeah, that was a key stepping stone. And of course, we had some political support. It's obviously helpful having a Prime Minister who was proud of it and championing it, and in even the fact that the media story also changes from very skeptical early on into it actually works.
And that has now allowed you guys to work on what you call wicked problems.
Yeah. Which
are, I think, more complicated than changing a sentence in a letter.
Yeah, exactly. So again, wicked problems, as many will know, refer generally to these complex big policy issues that look like they're intractable. So examples would be rising obesity across the world. You know, we just seem to be getting fatter and fatter and fatter, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's often taken as being, and they're complex because you look at the causality, it's very interlocked and so on. So we were always interested in those issues, but we've, essentially yes, as we have more credibility as the team grew as well, we'd be more and more getting into them. So they would include things like obesity or lifestyle issues would be a good one. Social mobility, disadvantage. Why don't disadvantaged kids, progress faster? I'm here partnering Harvard this week because of Bob Putnam's, retirement conference and his work on our kids, etc. Did you doing your work in relation to, can we do prompts and cues and interventions with kids who are basically, not doing well in schools and education to help them do better? Social mobility looks like a wicked issue. We also think about, you might think this is preposterous, but a lot of, what are the other great challenges? Another one is conflict, human conflict, integration, group conflict, domestically, but also internationally. So we're doing work which we're funding ourselves in Colombia, for example, looking at could we reduce the probability, hard to do as a randomized controlled trial, but we're thinking about it, of the reignition of a war. So only 2 wars start in the world every year, as you probably know, roughly speaking. Most of them are, well, at least half are reignition of previous conflicts. Well, what's involved in that? It's human beings falling out with each other in certain ways. Why can't we use behavioral science to take on those kinds of problems just as we can to prompt someone to pay their tax? Right? Why not? So that's our challenge.
Seems harder. So,
yeah, it will be harder. But
so when you think about these wicked problems, is there an you touched on like 3 or 4 of them. Is there one that would you mind like describing? Because like students, and there's literally hundreds of students at the Kennedy School who are wrestling with how do we use these kinds of insights and the experimental approach, but think of either to tackle rather than the kind of little interventions that my research might be, or some of us focus on, to these sort of like policy level, global, macro.
Well,
problems.
why don't we talk about obesity? It's a good example, a good lifestyle issue. Britain, by the way, is pretty much, fattest Europeans. Whoa. There are 1 or 2 tiny little states.
You're in America now. So.
I know, we're trying to catch up. And it looks like a classic wicked issue. And there was a big government analysis done a few years ago, sort of thing called the Foresight Report, which analysed the kind of causality. And it's sort of in policy wonk central. It's quite well known because it looks like a kind of plate of spaghetti because there's all these incredible pathways and routes of going backwards and forwards. But the net result is a classic illustration of a wicked problem. Is that everybody looks at it and says, well, you're so confident, where would you start? Or there's no point in us doing this thing here because we're this tiny piece of the puzzle. In fact, a classic illustration where people say on advertising, well, there's no point doing anything on advertising because it's at best the highest estimate is it explains 2% of this, problem or whatever. So how do we go about it? Well, we do, you're trying to analyze it in quite a lot of detail. As you know, the phrase sometimes used around mindless eating, we're literally not aware of what we eat. In fact, we concluded as we dug into it that even our official statistics had to be wrong, which we for 30 years for calories and wrong by a large margin, like, an additional 50% somehow is being missed, which is quite a big effect. And partly it's because, that was based literally on looking at if people were eating those calories and you worked out the metabolic effects, our hospitals will be full of people walking in who are emaciated, which turns out we don't have a big problem with in Britain. So you unpack the problem and you look at the various dynamics, including the market players. We ran lots of micro experiments, not only in the UK, actually in Australia, some of the key ones were done. So looking at substitution, if you put, the unhealthy drinks are harder to reach, what happens? Or if you test price, because we're looking at price elasticities and how people respond to it. We try and unpack it in a lot of detail. But in the end, partly because of its character and because people are so inattentive to it, we end up concluding you do actually have to do a lot of it by driving reformulation. Right? You're going to do it on the reformulation side, and then there are a number of routes through on it, one of which, by the way, turns out to be price, if you've got a substitutable product, a long story. Anyway, so you might know some in the UK, so we announced that we would introduce a sugar tax on beverage, on carbonated, high added sugar, not on all carbonated drinks, rather importantly, because it's substitution. So some people say, well, what's that? That's not a nudge, is it? It's like, well, the point is the whole thing was built on an analysis of human behavior and the actors and the part of it, and then the design of the tax itself in order to drive substitution, not desistance, etc., and ultimately to drive reformulation. So, of course, the beauty of it is most consumers don't have to change their behavior. And we're seeing massive effects, absolutely massive reductions in anticipation, even it's just kicking in actually now, of this change. It's a 2-level tax, I won't go into the detail, but as exactly as planned, massive reformulation, huge amount of sugar taken out of the food chain. So I personally am pretty upbeat. We'll now do some further works under work at the moment on obesity and other interventions that can be done that we'll look back on it and think, why did we think it was a wicked problem? Actually, when you really pulled apart the causality, there were lots of things we could do, and when we did them, hey, it worked. Well, we'll see, right? But I actually think it will work.
Careful, you never catch up to us if you're too effective on this. That actually is a nice illustration. There are 2 things. There's behavioral insights, there's experimental methods. And you were describing a story of where experimental methods help to inform the insights, but the policy, it doesn't lend itself very well, a national sugar tax to a randomized experiment. How do you think about the way they fit together, or at least the value that you create as a public servant in bringing the experiment side to the policy world, or the impact that the BIT has had in making experiments more accessible and more common?
Yeah, so there's a couple of elements in it. So yeah, it's rather important to note, sometimes you can literally do the experiment that goes directly to the policy lever. Sometimes it doesn't. It informs your understanding well enough to be more confident that the bigger policy change you'll make. But you're right. I mean, my own view is that, maybe in the future people will say the most useful thing that the Behavioural Insight team brought into government, in fact, wasn't just behavioural science, it was just the experimental method. It's sort of smuggled into government, and indeed is doing so, you might say, in many governments across the world, of the experimental method as a routine part of policy development and practice. And indeed, at the same time, is that lots of the small details, in inverted commas, of policy or practice turn out to be really consequential. So I also serve ministers now as what's called National Advisor on What Works, which sounds a bit crazy, I know, but it basically boils down to championing the use of more empirical methods. So we have built institutions that are dedicated to building up the evidence base, where possible plugging it, not least through doing actual experiments, and then of course taking it out into the field. So, and we do a lot of work, I think with public servants, or our policy profession, to try and get them all to know, in my view, any decent policy profession needs to know what a randomized controlled trial is, and a discontinuity method, and a step wedge design. And that just needs to be a routine part of how you do policy. You should be experimenting. That's not unique to us in the world. Beta's been doing that in Australia now and elsewhere. But it is an utter game changer. It is a totally different way of doing policy, right? So, in my world, you see lots of notes I've often written myself to ministers or prime ministers saying, we've assessed the evidence and this is what we would recommend doing. He might say, you could do this one if you really want, but you'll have to be a complete disaster, Prime Minister. So therefore, do this thing. But quite often, we should really have been saying, we don't know. The truth is, we don't really know what would be we think something like this might be effective, but there are like 20 other choices, and you don't have to know. You can just do policy where we will test deliberate variations and tune and improve it. But it does require, in particular, humility, which is to say, we're not sure, but it's a much better way of doing it. I genuinely think, and I hope our kids will look back and just think, like, what were you doing before, guys? You got this good idea, and then you'd roll it out at a national level, and you didn't test it before or after. And you're surprised it didn't always work? Yeah, so absolutely, experimentation is key.
So the humility, so you think that just so I'm understanding, you're saying that one of the biggest, if not eventually the biggest impact of BIT is that it brings about a greater intellectual and policy humility through the experimental method, legitimizes, authorizes, brings about the experience of humility among policy makers. That's some version of what's happening and/or what you hope.
Well, it's more, you could put it that way, otherwise you just say it's premised on you're overconfident. Most policymakers, in fact most of us in the world, are overconfident about what we think will happen, and indeed everything, exactly. Which is incidentally, by the way, maybe it's not a surprise that it comes from the behavioural science, because we're also, remember, at the same time, behavioural science giving an account about why we are overconfident about what we do. And it's not just sort of policymakers, it's human beings. I do think Jonathan Haidt's phrase on this is really great. It's interesting when Danny Kahneman talks about thinking fast and thinking slow, there's still a sort of presumption, well, at least when we're thinking slow, we're closer to a rational model and we're working it out properly and so on. Whereas, as Haidt puts it, is that if you listen to the voice in your head, it is primarily a press officer. It's not a natural scientist, right? It's like, it's telling you why the thing you already did was the right thing. So when, Todd, you get home and you just think, and you chuck your stuff on the floor and whatever, and your partner comes back and says, Jesus, Todd, again? And you're like, oh no, but the kids, I really had to sort out this. And you'll come up with a plausible explanation, which is generally bullshit if you attend to it, even you, Todd. So, yes, the humility is to actually understand
general,
that,
for most people.
That we're overconfident, that our brain is superb at plugging in the gaps, and sometimes when I'm myself doing exercises and we're doing events with senior policymakers, is we literally get them to look at their blind spots, with a cross and a circle, right, and it disappears when you hold it away. And then, of course, the main point is just how superb your brain is at plastering that. Like, as you're sitting here, you're not aware of the fact that you have 2 holes in your vision. Right, and if you can do that with your literal physical blind spot, how much more true is it when you're giving a view on educational policy or how to reduce crime or X, Y, Z? Your brain is going to tell you why what you're already doing is great. You don't need to make a change. So it's quite a big thing to try and get behind that and say, actually, no, half the time we don't know what we're doing. And that's the first basis for why you want to use these more empirical experimental methods. I mean, you can build on it the whole story around marginal gains and improvements. But the first stepping stone is to realize we're in the dark quite often, and we need to surface that lack of knowledge.
Which is a natural segue. So I know that, let's talk about the ethics and considerations about government being involved in this. How do you think about the ethics of this, and specifically, how do you think people misunderstand when they criticize and or get right when they criticize the ethical perils of this? And we don't need to talk about Cambridge Analytica, but you're welcome to if you.
Todd probably knows more about that than I do.
We're interviewing you.
But look, people are worried about it, and they certainly were. I mentioned in passing, we had difficulties when we wrote a paper, God, it was 203 or something, I can't remember, with Tony Blair on behaviour change and personal responsibility, and it blew up horribly in the media, partly because of the apprehension and concern about, government's now like there's a super nanny state and they're going to try and manipulate you, and so people do have those concerns. By the way, they're not crazy concerns, right? The point about this stuff is it can be used for good or for bad, and Cambridge Analytica, you can say, doesn't look that great for most people. I don't think it looks great myself. And indeed, of course, these techniques are being used all the time on us as citizens in the commercial world. Max is busy teaching, businesses how to do this better. We hope for good, but some won't use it for good, we know. So there are ethical concerns, which is one of the reasons why I felt very strongly myself that it's important that when governments and other organizations do use this, they should be very open about these techniques. Ideally, they should be asking citizens in quite a detailed way, what do you think? Once we show you this, where do you think the default should be set, and should enhance their sort of mechanisms? So it's controversial on the use of behavioral science. It's also controversial in relation to experiments. Let's not forget that. So for a lot of people, they think, oh my God, you're going to run experiments. You're going to run experiments. You, Todd, personally, are going to run experiments on our children. Whoa. But of course the counter is, well, how the hell otherwise will we know if it works? And in some countries, an obvious one is Germany. I remember when Merkel became very interested and sent over some of her very senior people, and we were showing them some of the results because they got interested in, like, the tax letter. Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, this is very interesting. I won't do the accent. But I don't think we'll be able to do that. So like, well, why not? It's, well, we're not allowed to experiment. We couldn't change the letter. It's like, we'd have to take it to Parliament to get permission to vary this letter. Of course, their constitution, literally, for understandable historical reasons, bans experimentation on humans.
In the Constitution?
Yeah. But that seems to include all these other things too. So it is, relevant, and people do have rival perspectives, which is it's not fair, and everybody should be treated the same. Of course, in square brackets, we might be treating everybody the same in a completely unhelpful, counterproductive way, but that's different story. So there is an argument to be won on the ethics of experimentation. In my own view, it's often unethical not to experiment because we're doing interventions and we don't know if we're doing harm or good. But that's definitely not won, and an argument that is won in the minds of everyone. Although I think what actually happens is that when you get institutions that are doing this, so I keep referring to experiments on kids, there's the Educational Endowment Foundation, it's a fantastic body in the UK, which has now run in the last 5-6 years experiments involving more than 1 million kids in the UK. And when people look at it, actually they think, well, that's pretty sensible, when they can see the outcome of it. But if you talk about it in abstraction, people do get pretty worried about it. But anyway, it's entirely appropriate that you should think about, and who gives you permission for it, and who nudges the nudgers, And in an academic setting, what's your ethical clearance mechanism? In a policy setting, it might also be, well, did your minister, what's your route to democratic, permission? And there's even just a last twist to it, which is that, in my view, when we were running experiments or trials, we're not just testing efficacy, we're also testing acceptability. And we have very occasionally had a trial where we've just received, a number of letters where people have said, why are you doing this? And why are you writing to me in this way? It doesn't feel right. And that can be enough grounds to say, well, let's not run with this, let's stop this trial and let's not run with this policy. So, yeah.
I like this distinction of, because we're talking about behavioral insights and experiments, there are different lines of objection to both of them, right? To experiments, there's fairness and a history of experimentation on humans. Behavioral insights is mind control, and then it becomes the responses to both of them and the legitimate objections are both different for both of them. It's useful to think that way. One of the things that you said that I had not thought of is, which I just want to put a pin in, is this almost a deliberative polling approach to it. So there's this polling strategy of instead of just polling people's uninformed, just sort of intuitive responses on a survey, you get a representative sample of people in a room for a weekend, and you inform them deeply about these policy issues, and you have them debate it and understand it, and then you take that as informative of what would an informed electorate want for the policy. And that's basically what you're implying for one way to think about the ethics is what would a truly informed on the results and risks population.
It's quite deep issues in a matter of governments there. So I'm long-standing a view that government should do more of those kinds of deliberative mechanisms for lots of reasons. But it's particularly true when you hit lifestyle matters, where governments have severe limits to their legitimacy, particularly, frankly, in the US, if you have slightly less trust in government than some other places, and people don't trust the government to do something. Well, to some extent, it's legitimate. You can make a decision about, a simple one, obesity would be, should you have rules around what's next at the checkout? So you've gone through the supermarket, you've been really good, you tried to make healthy choices all the way, and now, Baumeister style, you've almost exhausted your ability to avoid the cookies or whatever. Phew, you made it, and then you get to the checkout, and there's there's chocolate, right? Should that be in the business of government to say, no, I'm sorry, there shouldn't be chocolate by checkouts, right? And I personally think it's a much better situation generally to ask the citizens, show them the effects, what happens in terms of sales, etc., and then you say, well, what do you think? What would you like it to be? How do you set the default? Interestingly, it can sometimes affect directly it can be a signal to the market players. You say your customers want this. We've actually asked your customers now, and on reflection, they say they really don't want this. I do think we should enhance them much more. In my view, of course, an RCT, but the reason why we could hold the line on changing the defaults in pensions in the UK, like the 401k in the US, was because it was a very unusually good consultation. And you can tell the story a bit by saying the public, when shown the evidence, kind of gave government permission to change the default. So I think we should do much more of it.
That's great. I have one more question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I've read your writing on it, and we've talked about it a bit. There's so many frontiers for behavioral insights and behavioral scientists from, we're all going to be working on different directions. What is a frontier that you're particularly either excited about, worried about, or would like us to work on?
Oh.
So your choice.
Yeah, well, look, there's lots of them. As I said, partly it follows at least from the wicked problems issue.
Apart from...
That's fine. But I'm just saying, but it does follow. So a key one which we wrestle with a lot, in fact, Liz, who's here working on this issue in the UK, is market design. So quite often, so this may certainly be beyond the kind of comfort zone of some North American nudges, but often, you're trying to make these little prompts or changes to try and fix an aspect of a market, like should you set anchoring effects on your credit card bill, right? And should you change it or adjust them? So those are important, and we want regulators to be sophisticated about it. But sometimes, is there something more fundamentally wrong with the market dynamic? It's not unfolding in the right kind of way. So David Laibson here has talked about quite a lot over the years around shrouding in markets where they don't work well, and we think there are lots of markets that look that way. So it's hard enough for people to predict what's going on, but then of course you can often be in a situation now where, not least with big data, that companies can predict more accurately your behavior than you can yourself. So your use on, you know, a financial product or a mobile phone contract, whatever it will be, and that seems to us quite problematic. There are other more subtle aspects coming into play, so attentional capture. You know, if you're our young people, we think spend about 7.5 hours a day on screens of various forms.
How many hours?
7.5. You know, partly that, of course, is doing good stuff, and you're working, and you know, 2 hours a day will be on mobiles, and then blah blah, and then games, and it's not all bad by any means, but some of it does look problematic. And if you're designing products which are capturing attention, partly because you're going to sell adverts or whatever it would be, that looks like it's problematic, even though it's not a classic market failure. Anyway, so there's lots of these issues. There are lots of markets where we think at the same time there might be excessive use and problematic. There are some where have yet to be really engaged. So if you're trying to decide where to go and work, we were talking about this actually at lunch, but Glassdoor, what would be a better version of Glassdoor, a super version of Glassdoor, where you could really see the deeper characteristics of a firm? You know, is the boss an arsehole or someone you really want to work with? And are there progression opportunities or whatever it would be? These seem relevant information that would inform a consumer choice. You could even say from a classical point of view, but certainly from a behavioural point of view. So we're really interested in trying to unpack and solve some of those market dynamics, either be it through regulatory routes or by encouraging private sector players to come up and take on those sorts of challenges. And then you're really fixing things at root. So that would certainly be one major area, as well as trying to stop a few wars, increasing social mobility, see if we can make us fit, savings.
All right, but when we get to the important problems.
Okay.
Well, so just so people know, a market design is a phrase that has meaning to me and others, some others. Right. But so can you give, government always has a role in market design, and I'm not sure that people, that's a concept that people are familiar with. Just so that to provide context, would you mind giving a little background on when you think market design? It's a legitimate function of government. Right. In fact, it's a necessary function of government. Okay.
Well, you also want to catch Liz afterwards. I'll give you a simple example. I always think in markets, in neuropsych, when traditionally people used to study the sea slug, which is a very simple creature because it's got very simple neurons, and you can kind of prod it there and it wiggles at the other end, and you can, anyway, whatever. And the equivalent in markets, a lot of markets are very complicated, but is the energy market. The energy market looks really simple on both sides of the Atlantic in most countries. Most people don't really care about that kind of, it's the same kind of energy. If it comes from one country, a company or another, you might care a little bit about whether it's from a green source if you're Max, but otherwise most people don't really care that much, sadly. And yet still we see, in a country like UK, when you had half a dozen major providers, most consumers, it's thought, would save in dollars roughly $500 a year if they switched providers, and they don't switch. It's well, that's kind of weird, isn't it? What's that about? And from a classical view, you'd often look at it and say, well, there's no market failure because there's lots of providers and you could switch, and it's not that, because from a behavioural point of view, there are lots of failures. So there's lots of friction. So I remember we were going to discuss this, became a very big political issue in the UK, in fact it still is, and we were discussing it with the PM, and I thought, as we often try and do from a behavioural point of view, let's try it out ourselves. So that weekend I thought I'll switch my energy supply, because I know I'm one of those 9 in 10 people who hadn't switched for years, and what's wrong with me? And so I tried to switch, and I spent an hour or 2 on it, and I failed, right? Because it turned out I needed a certain kind of number called the MPAN number, which isn't on my bill. There's another number on the bill. So I then had to call up the energy company, give them this number, and then they will give me the MPAN number, and then I can use the MPAN number to go to a switching site, and Anyway, I failed. My wife, Jennifer, actually did succeed, I should say. But in the end, if you were a cynic, you might say, well, if you're an energy company, you're making most of your money from your inert customers who aren't moving. And indeed, you might say you even deliberately charge them more. and you're adding friction because you don't really want people to switch. Anyway, a long story, right? But so what do you then do about it as a government? So a classical market analysis says, oh, is there really a problem here? Well, you want to be obsessed about trying to reduce those frictions. And then it can go potentially further, where you should say, one often response is often, the problem is not the market, it's you guys. You're not engaged consumers. Come on, you should be switching more often, right? And so that's one possible response. The other is, well, maybe actually you do have other things, and we need to work on the market design to say how else can we influence, either by changing rules. So we, for example, got companies to have to put QR codes which would summarize. You could put your phone against it and then it would switch because it would show you real fast. Right. Or do other things which are being discussed now, which is that can you do things with those inert customers, and you say, well, I tell you what, why don't we take every quarter 500,000 of those customers, and we will give them or auction them in some way to the best performing companies. So it's a much more assertive market intervention to try and change the underlying dynamics. Anyway, you can imagine it gets quite complicated, even in a simple market. But as you say, regulators are going to be in the business anyway. And the most fundamental, I guess, the way I think about it is, in many areas, companies are using quite a lot of techniques. They're in fact probably employing lots of people who've listened to your lectures at some point, to try and figure out how you'd add friction or how do you get some advantage in the market. Fair enough to some point. Who's on the consumer side?
That's the business school.
Yeah, fair enough.
No, I'm sorry.
Who's on
fair.
On the consumer side to say, how can we structure this market to really make it for the consumer and to function better? And that applies we take price as a simple example with energy, but it's true in relation to other things. So like, attentional capture. So if you're spending all your time on the Facebook newsfeed, enormous computational power is being used by Facebook, and a lot of skill and technique to keep your attention. Who's on your side to do the reverse, like as it were, to manage your time for you, the best outcome you want? So that would come to potentially a market design challenge.
That's great. Thank you.
All right.
I'm going to open it up to some questions from the audience. But David, I want to introduce you to the norms of this. This place is unusual.
Okay.
People, when they ask questions, are expected to use question marks at the end. So it's got to be in the form of a question. And if you have a question, please say your name and be succinct and end with a question mark. That's what we say to people. There are microphones around. If anyone, I will
okay.
Hold, please.
Hi, my name is Ryan Davis, and I'm a junior at the college. So you briefly mentioned that in addition to screening for efficacy, you also screen for acceptability, which I assume you are referring to something that is just so far out there, like a nudge that's just kind of strange. It doesn't meet the certain threshold needed to be implemented. Does that also refer to, say, a nudge that becomes very famous and is no longer as subtle as it used to be, and then maybe for some reason loses its effectiveness?
What was the question mark on it?
So
look, it hasn't happened very frequently. I'll give you an example of the first part of your question, which is what would it look and feel like? So we did, in the height of, from 2008 to 12, we had liquidity issues in our economy on both sides of the Atlantic, and so we're doing a lot of interventions to try and get money moving better. And one of the interesting, to be very narrow questions, but was people's credit scores. And people don't understand how a credit score is composed, and there are some simple actions you can take to improve your credit rating. And so we did an intervention sort of writing to a load of people saying, hey, if you do the following things, you can improve your credit. And we can get loads, but I don't know, we've probably got half a dozen, maybe even letters back from a sample of 1,000. People saying, why are you writing to me about this thing? And so it was like, okay, fair enough. People didn't. So that would be an example, right? Even if the intervention was effective, people didn't feel right to them, and so we didn't proceed with it. You asked about what happens when these interventions become so familiar they become less effective. We do have a not very funny joke, I admit, but 9 out of 10 governments are now using the social norm interventions. But it does seem, from George Lowenstein and other work, what's very striking is that they nonetheless seem to be persistently effective. Our house sort of summary view, actually Todd of course has thought about this quite a lot as well, is that generally when you're using these techniques, because they're sort of appropriately called nudges, I think often gentle sort of persuasion and encouragement, they tend to work particularly around things that people want to do anyway. Whereas if you're trying to get someone to do something that they didn't really want to do, as they get wise to it, fortunately, they become less effective. And so I think that's probably broadly a reasonable summary of the effectiveness. I sometimes just give you a simple example. You're too young to have a watch, something as retro as that looks like. But for people who do still use such museum pieces, many of us set our watches fast, which always seems like a quarter, a third of people seem to do that. Well, what's that about? You're your watch is fast, right? You're sort of self-nudging, but it's still effective. But because you're getting yourself to do something you kind of want to do anyway, and I think they often work because it works when you need it to. So if you're not in a hurry, you make the mental adjustment, Todd, about you need to get because you're going to be late. But when you are in a hurry, you don't make the adjustment, and it does in fact help you turn up on time. So even when we know it and we do it to ourselves, it can be persistently effective. So it's not surprising that more generally that would be true.
Thank you.
Great. Please.
Hi.
Multi-level.
Wow, okay. My name is Sakshi. I'm a
Hi.
student at the business school, actually. So towards the end, you were talking about a few potential applications. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about that, specifically, if you're not in a position of working for government and you're working in the private sector or as part of a company or starting your own company, where do you see kind of the most interesting applications for kind of using behavioral science to actually improve things, whether that's, in environmental areas or or consumer choice, whatever that is, because it's hard when you're not coming from maybe the public sector.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, we've kind of cantered through it at quite a high level, and of course the lifeblood of this whole area is just kind of the results. We've initiated more than 500 odd trials, and so if we had longer, it'd be great just to rattle through some of those very concrete things and why it's very satisfying. They also bring it to life.
Go ahead.
Favorite recent ones, I don't know, reducing the dropout of national citizen service by half by introducing young people to someone else. I love the study supporter stuff, which we're doing with Todd, which is by sending text to people. Would you like to nominate someone else to be your study supporter to prompt and help you? We're getting roughly a 25% improvement in the grades. This is in retakes. More latest versions look more like 50%, which is incredible by combining it. By explaining to people when they've been caught speeding and adding in the letter, why the speeding limit is set, that we not only can get people to pay their fine faster, we can nearly halve the prosecution rate because people pay without having to go to court, and really neatly is it reduced subsequent speeding by 20%. Anyway, there are loads and loads of these. So, by the way, but they were not entirely random examples.
Inside the nudge unit.
Well, or you could just, obviously we try and put our results, out in the public domain. But to come back to your question, so, I mean, some of those things themselves don't have to be delivered by state. So educational interventions that can help kids do better, well, actually schools buy loads of things all the time. It's perfectly possible. In fact, one of the great things about the Educational Endowment Fund, which is supporting experiments, is that you're getting companies now out there thinking, we think we could do a bit of technology which would help support and prompt kids to learn better and do better. Hey, we'll run a trial on it, and then if it works well, it'll be out there, it'll be in the toolkit, and then we've got 24,000 schools in the UK alone. Well, they'll go and buy your thing, right? Hopefully. So there can be even, there are lots of opportunities for innovative players to do things for public services and good. I mean, the UK government alone procures 250, $300 billion a year, for example. The US government, surely you've got funds like SBRIs, so there's an opportunity to do that. But there's also, look, in Max's world, there are lots of things you can hopefully do in the commercial world, which would be innovative and potentially behaviorally based interventions, which will do good, right? And then they can diffuse through the market. So just BIT has been involved. One of the reasons why we changed our status to make it possible to sometimes, when the solution it's not a government policy. You want someone to do something disruptive in a market, right, which will be a great product, and that will sort of change the equilibrium. So one, actually an ex-course Harvard person who developed in our team has built this platform called Applied, which we support, which is basically a better way of doing recruitment, with Iris and others being involved. I mean, how neat is that? If you can debias recruitment and you can get better predictions, you can reduce your HR time, and it can succeed in the market. And you don't really want the government producing a product like that. You want someone else. So there are lots of things like that. And one of the great challenges is, can we use this? I really feel strongly. Can we use this for good in markets? And clearly it's possible. But that's why the title, is, will behavioral science make the world a better place? Well, it might do. It certainly can do. Will it? Depends on what we do with it, right? So,
Thank you.
Yeah. Way too long, I'm sorry.
No,
Hey,
it's great.
my name is Pat Healy. I'm over at the Ed School. Can you give an example of a nudge that you were really excited about, that seemed really promising, that for whatever reason just didn't work?
Oh, yeah. Great question. Definitely I can. So we had a few of them, but maybe not too many, a respectable number. We're not the only ones. There's one, we're doing a lot in criminal justice. We had a fantastic foundation that actually continues to support interventions, and like the one on speeding actually was supported by this particular foundation. There was another one we thought would be really neat. Maybe you guys will think it's horrible and unethical, but we thought, if you've done something and you end up in a jail cell, you're literally a captive audience, right? And we might as well think about what would be a good thing. Well, you're sat there for potentially quite a few hours. If there's going to be something written on the wall, what would be a good thing to write on the wall? So we did this. We developed this script, which was done with some ex-offenders who'd gone through the process, and it was basically a kind of reflection on, I actually was sat in your situation. I'd done something wrong. I kept blaming other people for it. So we basically used a combination of behavioral science, but actually also real scripts from actually particularly one person. And we had this thing written out with this sort of reflection. This guy had it on the wall of the cells. And then the question was, would it reduce subsequent reoffending? Sadly, it was not significant. But it's like, oh God, it did really seem like a good idea. So anyway, it may be that a better message would work, but we have had a few of those, and if you want to catch me afterwards, I could probably think of some more. Yeah.
Please.
Hi, my name is Will Poff-Webster. I'm a recent graduate of the college. I wanted to ask about behavioral change in politicians. If politicians are making decisions largely based on voting behavior, and voters are afraid of changes to the status quo, or not voting for someone because that they are making an improvement on the margin to a particular quantifiable thing, what's the best way, institutionally or persuasively, to kind of convince politicians that this is a good idea, that they should pursue this? Other than 9 in 10 governments do it.
Well, remember, it's actually operating on several levels, which is, one is almost the practice of government, in the nuts and bolts. You should ask for experiments. You should be asking, why do you think that's true? You should sign innovation funds. You also were rehearsing it in relation to, ideally you'd see it in your own behavior too. So if you go on and become a senator or whatever, but you've listened to Todd, you'll actually be aware of these effects and biases in your own thinking, or indeed in a similar way that business leaders will get that from Max in HBS. We're actually writing a paper at the moment, which we're going to publish shortly, which is behavioral effects and biases applied to policymakers, to be aware of it, like, know your own kind of biases and errors, and how you could then supplement them or deal with them more effectively. So I think that's one take on it. But otherwise, I don't know. I mean, we engage with policymakers. They know. I mean, obviously ministers and prime ministers. They've been actually pretty receptive for the most part. But you're right, partly it would be actually about what I think you're saying, is you should apply that reflexivity internally. There's actually a very nice lecture which was given a few years ago in one of the BX events, and the one in London by, I think it was one in London, maybe it wasn't, by Donald Lowe, who's a very interesting, thoughtful guy who's written about this from the Singapore government. So anyway, you might want to watch out. We'll put this paper out quite shortly. So yeah.
I've sometimes wondered whether the use of behavioral science and experiments in campaigning might migrate into an appreciation at least of its power, of its potential impact, because behavioral science has had a reasonable impact on the way campaigns are run.
So I think that's right. I mean, I think we had an interesting situation actually a few years back. I was quite struck by, I remember, where, because the Obama administration, not least some people close at hand, were involved in using these techniques exactly in relation to campaigning and getting the vote out and getting donations. And so once you've done that, you think, well, why wouldn't you apply it back into the policy world? And there's definitely a bit of that. Weirdly, in the UK, partly because of maybe campaign rules, we were in the situation where we were doing far more of it in relation to policy than was happening in the campaign side. And in some ways, it almost gone the other way, is that policymakers and politicians thinking, hey, could we do this on the party side?
Oh, that's interesting.
But of course, we have quite tough restrictions on expenditure and all the rest of it. But yeah, doubtless that's happening.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name's Aisling. I'm a student at the...
I can't.
Sorry. My name's Aisling. I'm a student at the law school. And I'm just wondering about have you ever thought about the behavioural science as applied to companies? So, for example, when you're implementing, say, for example, the sugar tax, are you just thinking about the behaviour of individuals? Or is there a role for behavioural science in determining how law and policy will affect companies other than through the market?
We definitely thought about that. Also, our business department have thought about that and did a paper on it. It's something we return to periodically. And some of our trials are actually aimed at companies, certainly micro companies. So, for example, payment of tax doesn't only apply to individuals. We did a very big trial, I think 750,000 in, was it Mexico? On small businesses, getting them to declare their tax and so on, which was very effective. So it definitely applies. There's a presumption, especially with larger companies and institutions, is that they will look more like, they'll behave more rationally, right? I mean, maybe Max will answer this question better than me. But we still think there are a lot of those effects are in play. In the UK, for example, we've just did a big push which is on gender pay gap reporting. And I think we were very aware of trying to use some techniques to make sure that companies did in fact come through and how that would play out going forward. And then people, certainly the tops of organizations, are also human beings. So they care, for example, about honors. I mean, honors seem like a really odd, quirky thing. What's this point in an honor? But actually, honors matter a lot in most societies to people. So the fact in our context that the Queen might call you up and say, come along and I'll pin this thing on your chest, really matters a lot. And by the way, importantly, you can't buy it. Well, you're not supposed to be able to buy it. Anyway, so there are definitely these other kinds of levers which are neglected and are desperately important. And even if I go back to the obesity example, right, so a lot of the analysis, of course, it's premised on what the individuals would do, but we sometimes call it a double or a triple nudge, because you're trying to move a small number of marginal consumers. Actually, the primary movers will be the retailers and the producers. And you need to understand the world they're living in. So if you're a retailer, you might really want to do the right thing in lots of ways, but a big drinks company will turn up just before the end of your financial year and say, hey, we'll give you, $20 million if you'll put this stuff at the end of aisles, right? That's the world they're in. So you're going to have to understand that well, and you're going to have to understand what's their vector for finding a kind of route through. So yeah, it's absolutely interlocked.
So we'll take one last question, and then...
I think he was before me, yeah. He was waiting before I was. So
Okay, that's very polite.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm John McCoy. I'm a grad student at MIT.
Hi.
When you initially start off working with countries that haven't traditionally done much behavioral public policy, are they kind of standard places that you look for quick wins or low-hanging fruit, or does it just differ tremendously across countries?
Well, our general technique is, there are lots of approaches. So some countries, of course, have come to us, and many are building their own capability. And some stuff we're funded to do now, particularly through, for example, something called the Global Innovation Fund, which is DFID money in the UK, but is other agencies put money into, which is to try and help build the capability. So actually from out, I didn't really talk about that, but even in the UK context, a lot of our work has been build the capabilities of the organisations, build the capabilities of other government departments, etc., etc. So the question is, how do you do it? And that was partly my point also about try and get conversion rather than just make someone comply. So you naturally start with some of the same suite. Tax is an obvious one in many administrations, even administrations which might not have very high quality administration in a kind of classic industrial nation sense. generally have some kind of, you're going to send someone a letter, did they pay, did they not, So you've got some basic infrastructure. It's also very well suited because it's not, despite my earlier remarks, not that fundamentally difficult to introduce variations in letters. But because the key point is not just that you're trying to increase the tax revenue, the deeper question is you're trying to train the administration simultaneously, in a real example, with behavioural science. Let's think about the alternative effects here, what might be an effective cue or variation in the message, and you're teaching them about the use of experimentation. And so I do think this is true in general for humans, is that we handle issues much better in practical examples, right, than we do in theory. So you're much better off to have a concrete example working through with some administrators, and they're like, oh yeah, I get it. And of course, hopefully, like, well, if it works here, then what other areas could we apply it to? So that's I would say, in a nutshell, our general approach.
Thanks. That sets up the last question I want to ask you. Speaking of concrete examples, so what concrete skills would an HKS graduate need to be successful in behavioral science?
I'll definitely answer. I just remember the additional caveat, which is that that's not a bad question for what do you think most policymakers, civil servants, politicians should have, and it would be substantially overlapped. So, yes, understand more deeply how human beings make decisions. Danny Kahneman's work's fantastic, and loads of others. It's incredibly rich, growing literature now. So it's almost unthinkable not to, most policy involves human beings, so you need to have that detailed understanding. So go to your courses, obviously. So that would be pretty high up there. But what would also include, you really need to understand these basic methods. As I explained earlier, I do think they're premised on some notion of humility, which applies to all of us ourselves. You should understand what a randomized controlled trial is and how you do it, and how do you power calculation. You should understand discontinuity methods and step wedges and difference. I mean, not a very long set, but have those really to your fingertips. Nice to have, be able to do some fancier analysis, not least in a world of machine learning and so on. I mean, ultimately, of course, to apply it in practice, you also have to understand the problem at hand. And let's not forget that too. It doesn't shortcut the need for, like on obesity, to understand, well, what are the dynamics of the market, of the various kind of plays, what's going on, what are the constraints and the actual mechanics of the bureaucracy. You might not get that all here, but you might certainly get the beginning of it. I really think it's very hard. We certainly think about it in relation to the British Civil Service, but many others, that of course you should have these skills. It's just going to be, I think, self-evident in a near future that certainly as a policymaker or in the public sector you should understand these aspects. And not just policymakers in a narrow sense, but the millions of public servants. If you're a teacher, what's the best way of understanding what's going on in your kids' heads? If you're a clinician, understand issues about the fear and concerns of your patients. Or if you're a social, you need to understand this, I think, better than we have done historically. And then I remain really optimistic. I think this stuff is very, very powerful. One of the reasons why, I won't get to the end really, but we've had a reasonably good hit rate, despite we've had some that didn't work, of course, rightly. And I think that's partly a story, in contrast, by the way, to the commercial world, where experimentation often has low kind of yields back. And that's just because huge tracts of policy and public service are they're kind of virgin territory. We never did test or experiment or improve them. So the great news is, for your students as they flow through, you apply this stuff, it's pretty damn likely you're going to come up with better policies and practice. And that is just extraordinarily exciting. And if I could leave you almost with one thought, one of the most gratifying, exciting things about this work has sometimes been when you are able to show a public servant or potentially a senior policymaker, but often literally on the ground, like in those job centres, that it turns out when you make this relatively small change and you do it the following way, you get better outcomes, right? And that it wasn't that complicated. You didn't need to wait for some order on high to come. Actually, it was within your hands to vary some aspects of the practice and improve the outcome. In the same way, a teacher could improve the outcome, not necessarily by spending loads and more, but with the way in which they give feedback to a class. I mean, that's incredibly powerful and exciting for most people, especially who've gone into public service, to realize you can use these techniques, not just up there, floating up in space somewhere, or in Washington, but you can use them in your actual practice and get these tangible improvements, and the things that those are what you got out of bed in the morning to do. You can get better at doing that using these techniques. So that's cool, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the work you do and for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.